Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Welcome to Season 5 of the show. I'm excited to share some news with you about the Queer Spirit Podcast community. Until now, we've had a private Facebook group for listeners and a separate Patreon group for backing supporters. As someone who values building queer community and keeping our queer spaces sacred, I've decided to merge and move both groups to a new private community on Mighty Networks. This new space is free from the distraction of advertisements and clickbait, where we can gather together in a virtual community of our own co-creation. There will also be more opportunities for live gatherings like meditation groups, support circles, and virtual sound baths, so stay tuned. To join us in our new space, go to queerspirit.mn.co. That's queerspirit.m as in Mary, N as in Nancy.co. You can also find the link in the show notes. Okay, now on with the show. My guest today is Sifu DeVante Love. DeVante is a gay Olympic martial artist, QTBIPOC Counselor, wellness coach, and spiritual teacher. They have over a decade of experience guiding thousands of folks across the world who have felt weighed down by their trauma, anxiety, stress, and cultural expectations. They are the founder of Healing Kung Fu, an online queer and BIPOC-friendly spiritual martial arts school, which teaches people how to attain new levels of wellness through movement meditation practices. After getting their master's in spiritual psychology from Columbia University, they were invited to train, teach, and compete all over the U.S. and internationally. Today, DeVante talks about how they came to find Kung Fu through the practice of meditation as a child. They share about teaching oppressed communities to use principles of Kung Fu and meditation to gain self-awareness, expand consciousness, and heal. Find DeVante online at healingkungfu.com. Hi, DeVante. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So you do some really interesting things. You've really synthesized some interesting practices, which I've actually studied and explored at different parts of my life. But I wonder if you can start out by telling us the story of how you first got interested in martial arts.
Yeah. So I was in about elementary school and I started learning karate, actually. And I remember my teacher was telling us to get angry with our punches and imagine we were kicking through someone's body. And every time I got those instructions, I just felt uncomfortable. I felt like I'm learning this practice to perpetuate violence, and there's already so much violence in the world. So I left the studio and I'm like, martial arts is dumb. This is not for me. No, 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 no. And then about middle school is when I came out to people and I told them that I was gay. And my mom was really concerned about my health and safety. And she's like, I want you to learn some sort of self-defense practice just in case. So I started looking around at different martial arts again. And I was like, I'm not doing karate because of that one experience. And I found a Kung Fu studio. And the way that they taught Kung Fu was not to destroy other people, but more so to strengthen yourself and to understand yourself and move your body in accordance with your own energy. And I was like, that felt interesting to me. I had been meditating since about 10 years old. I had been talking to spirits and all of that. So the idea of bringing energy work into the martial arts movement practice, into Kung Fu, was interesting. So I started training with them and I just fell in love with it. And I took it to a whole nother level, adding in my own element of spirituality. And now it's become a practice that I do daily, sometimes twice a day. And it's been about 16 years of deep training. And I am so grateful for what it's brought me.
Wow, great. Did you say you started meditating at the age of 10?
I did. I had a really bad stutter around that age. You can't tell now because I've learned how my body works and how my thoughts work. And so I went into the bookstore and I saw this Meditation for Dummies book. I opened the first couple pages. It says it can help you slow down your mind and get in touch with your body. So I was like, great, this is how I'm going to get over the stutter thing, because At that point, people were making fun of me, and I was supposed to go into like a special education classroom. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. So I was kind of desperate for meditation at that point, and I got so deep into it, and it really helped me, not just with the stutter, but with so much. And I just fell in love with it. It became like a positive drug that really helped me stay centered and expand myself at such a young age. And I've kept up with it now, and it's been deeply life-changing.
Wow, that's really cool. What did your family think when their 10-year-old started meditating or reading about meditation?
I remember, so my grandmother has like this deep interest in the East Asian culture. So when I talked about meditation, she's like, oh, I'll do that too with you. So she tried it out one day and she's like, no, this is too slow for me. So she kind of like gave up. My mom tried with me a couple times, and then she got like overwhelmed and busy. So she kind of gave it up. So it's nice that my family tried. And then they sort of knew the times that I was meditating, and they're like, okay, DeVante is going to go meditate, but let's leave them alone. So they kind of gave me my space to do this whole meditation thing. They didn't understand what I was doing, but they knew that I wasn't harming other people and I was feeling better about myself. So they were like, do it, do it.
Very cool. Prior to that, were you raised any particular religion or spiritual practice?
Yeah. So I grew up in the Baptist church. And so we went to church on Sundays. We had like, I think Bible study on Wednesdays or something like that. And it was fun to be in that church environment because literally the spirit and the energy of that space is just, it's high energy. You know, people are singing and they're dancing, and it just feels like people are trying to kind of purge in some way, but also kind of like be in community with each other. So I love being in church. I didn't agree with a lot of what was said and, you know, the bigger clouds of ideology, but being in that space was nice. And so I told myself, like, if I'm leaving the church, which I did around the time I came out, if I'm leaving the church, I want to make sure to be in a spirited community that I can still get that exchange of energy and that sort of sense of Eros with the people that I'm around. So that's what I've tried to create with my business and with Healing Kung Fu right now. It's a community of other people who are interested in their own personal development and their liberation. And there's this like high energy toward like self-cultivation through the practices. And I'm still working to grow it to what I remember the church to be, but it's something that I am aspiring toward.
Now, you just said something about attaining that sense of Eros in that similar kind of setting. And I'm wondering what Eros means to you, because I think a lot of people might hear that and think, well, why are you having erotic feelings while you're in church?
Yes, I'm happy you asked that. Sometimes I throw around terms and I think people know what's going on in my brain, but they don't.
No, it's great. I think it's important, especially, you know, on this podcast, I like to talk about the connection between our bodies and sexuality and spirituality. So I'm curious to know your experience.
Yeah. So the way that I see Eros is just the connection that we have to another person. It could be sexual, it could be sensual, but for the most part, it's just some sort of connection. It's the way in which, as we're talking, you know, I'm breathing and then you're breathing, and there's this sort of dance between our energies and our bodies as we're communicating with each other. It's the ways in which, you know, when two people are together, their energies either blend together or they kind of like, you know, contrast in some way. And for me, tapping into the sense of Eros is realizing what my energy is doing with the person that's next to me and leaning into that and allowing that to guide the conversation, guide our experience together. So it's just a very mystical way of talking about a deeper form of connection and drawing attention and sensitivity to the connection that we have with other people.
Yeah, I like to tell people that Eros is just the spiritual or soul connection energy. You know, it's the feeling in the soul or the spirit that we feel, and the way you talk about it in connection with other people or connection with the divine or connection with nature or connection with ourselves even. Yeah. So I feel like I'm starting to understand you a little bit more now, even though you've just given me a little bit, because, you know, I've never been to a Baptist church, but I've been to hear gospel music, and I've been outside Baptist churches, and I can just feel the energy coming out of it. And it's very embodied because it's very ecstatic, right? And then I can see how you go from that to like studying and practicing meditation and then turning to Kung Fu, which is kind of like a blend between the two of like, I'm being embodied in my spirituality, but I'm also being embodied in my power and by calming my mind and my spirit. And yeah, it's just really cool to hear just those early beginnings of all those little seeds that were planted in your childhood and how they started to create the flower that you are today.
Oh, that was a beautiful explanation and bringing together of everything that I said. It's very true. And a lot of my focus is on the body itself, because I had like a lot of like disordered eating when I was younger and like a lot of body shaming and all of that. So I was like, this body is something that I can't get rid of. It's something I have. I want to cultivate it in a way that I'm showing love toward it, but not just love, but I'm showing like appreciation and recognizing how my body is a representation of myself. And the more that I care about my body, that's showing care toward myself and it's helping me grow in some other way. Like people read all these self-help books and they do all these things, they attend seminars and they get all these beautiful ideas. But if they don't bring it into the body, then I wonder how well those ideas actually integrate into their way of being. And so my focus is really taking all of these beautiful concepts and then putting it into the body so the body can communicate back to you, because the body says so much and it stores memories, as we know. And if we don't involve the body in the conversation, if we try to do something, but the body's not involved, the body might reject that idea and then there's no change that's happening. So there needs to be an alignment between what's going on in the mind, the body, and a deeper level, the spirit or the soul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very similar to, I do a somatic therapy work with folks. And one of the things I talk about is, the conversation between the mind, the heart, and the body, right? Because two of those parts might be in agreement about something, but another part might not be. Maybe the body and the heart are in agreement about something, but the mind's like, I don't know about that, right? And so I think that's really important that you're bringing those things together in that way. So I wonder if you can share with us a little bit more about who you work with and the kinds of work that you do and what that work looks like.
Yeah. So I work with a variety of people, center my practices around people of color and queer folks, partially because those are identities that I hold myself. And through my own practice, I have certain takeaways and learnings that I then filter through my own graduate level psychology work, and then I teach to other people. I think it's really important as a spiritual teacher, as a somatic therapist, that whatever I'm teaching other people, I've done the work through myself. I've looked at like the theories and I've tested it before I give it out to other people. And so a lot of what I do is I'm talking through my own experience. And in my practice, when I teach, I have regular group classes and I have like special seminars and workshops and I work with people individually. But what I do is I teach people different movements, and the movements that are based out of Chinese martial arts, so Kung Fu movements. And I show them how these movements allow them to feel the energy within themselves, feel the energy around, and have that sort of erotic, that connection between self and world. And, I show them the intricacies of the movements. I teach them different ways to think. I spark their imagination. I bring back memories. So it all comes together into the movement. And I find it as a beautiful process to integrate whatever's going on within their lives. So the practices it starts with helping someone become more sensitive to themselves and to the environment, being more aware of the senses, how energy is moving through the body and around the body. And then we start to go to introspection. So we look inward and understand like what's going on, why is this happening, what is the core wound or the core issue that's trying to be addressed. And then we wrap it all up with more martial arts movements to help integrate everything, to bring it all together into alignment, so that someone can then shift or change or transform or create a new behavioral pattern or way of being for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you might really be able to customize the work that you're doing with people based on what their internal experience is, because it's probably going to be a little different for everyone.
Yes. And I think that's where my sensibilities as a spiritual teacher come in, because when I talk to people, I've had this from a young age where someone starts talking to me and they're saying something, but I'm hearing something else from them. I'm hearing like the wounds that they have not addressed. I'm hearing their ancestors or their loved ones who have passed away telling me things about them that they're not yet saying. And then somehow it comes up a conversation that I'm able to continue the conversation with the information that I've gathered. So there's a way that I utilize my own sensitivity to help people understand the deeper issue of what's going on. And then I do customize the movements in that way. The practices, I have 140 something different forms that I work through with people. And each form I can teach it from a psychological perspective, a spiritual perspective, an emotional perspective, or physical perspective. So there's all these dimensions that I can address with someone. And then I have core forms, like I have forms for trauma, anxiety, stress, grief. I have forms for intuition, past life regression, these sort of things. So there's different sets of themes that fall into these individual forms. And so it's like an artistic way of approaching this embodied psychological, spiritual work. And I love it. It's so fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really cool. I'm curious to know what you might have seen, especially in the last 2 years as we've gone through all this COVID stuff and quarantine, if there are specific forms you see people needing, especially right now with the energy that's moving through the world right now, maybe around anxiety or worry or grief or loneliness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of need for grounding work. So things that are really related to the element of earth or the realm of earth. People were tapping into the idea of suffering, of care, self-care, care of other people, their own suffering, the suffering of the world. I was doing a lot of earth practice because all of that falls under earth. And as time has gone on, I find that now there's this strong call for work related to anxiety and even work related to intuition. So psychologically, anxiety, spiritually, intuition. And I think anxiety, because people don't know what's going to happen, we're opening up to some extent. No one really knows how things are going to go, but people are now eager to kind of go back out into the world. And they're not quite sure exactly how to do that. There's so much uncertainty and unknown, and that causes a sense of anxiety for people. And in terms of the intuition aspect, I find that because the pandemic, a lot of people were like at home and they tuned inward very deeply. And so they have a stronger connection to their intuition, but they don't necessarily have the relationship with it yet. So a lot of people want to cultivate that stronger relationship so then they can better understand how it is that they want to show up and be in the world. So I find that these are the two areas right now that are really alive within my teaching.
Yeah, I can really see that, how that's really helpful. And I'm wondering what you see queer people in particular getting from these kinds of practices, what kinds of transformations you might have seen in this work.
I want to say that from my experience, this work impacts queer people the most. And part of that is because someone who is queer is trying to navigate these different energies that exist. And we have this sort of binaristic way of thinking of like man, woman, right, wrong, masculine, feminine. And a lot of us as queer folks, we're trying to like understand, what does that mean for us? Am I more feminine? Am I more masculine? These sort of things. And what I like about the forms and the practices is it helps you to hold both of the energies and then feel how it stretches within the body. So literally there's movements where we're stretching and you're literally opening the body up to stretch. And it feels awkward and uncomfortable, but that awkward and uncomfortableness of pulling these energies in the body allows you to navigate it when you're out in the world. When you're out in the grocery store and you have to sort of decide something, because you've had this experience of holding these opposing energies and that sort of awkwardness, and you feeling yourself expand in that practice. When you're out in the grocery store having that conversation with someone who misgenders you, for example, you're able to look at that from a different perspective because you were in a practice that tackled it from a somatic, energetic level. So it's really about, I think, us as queer people, we have this beautiful ability of, I would say, holding opposing energies and also gaining different perspectives. And our existence itself is a threat to a lot of people who don't question their own identity or question the way that they are in the world. And so also with these practices, they are Kung Fu practices. So they are self-defense practices. They're self-cultivation, self-preservation practices. So because people are threatened, they're going to throw things at you verbally. They're going to throw their emotions at you. They're going to throw all these different things at you. And because of these different practices, you have literal tools that you can practice every single day for 5 minutes. And it gets you in that mindset of how do I deal with this world that doesn't yet accept me? How can I still be myself and not capitulate or like shrink down because the world is saying that I'm wrong or I'm strange or I need to fix something.
Yeah.
So they're just really handy tools to navigate all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to share a little bit of my experience with martial arts, a few years ago, it's probably like 10 years ago now, I was working with a body worker who I think the topic of boundaries came up. And I'd never thought about practicing martial arts. I'd done a lot of yoga, but I hadn't practiced martial arts before. And he suggested I look into it. And so I just started looking around and seeing what was in the area and what was available. And I found this practice called Wing Chun, and which I believe is related to Kung Fu or comes out of Kung Fu. I'm not sure.
Yes, it is a style of Kung Fu. Yes.
And it was interesting to practice it. It was just me and the teacher and one other person, and the teacher and the other guy were both straight men. And the other student was actually a retired cop. So when I first met him, here's this big guy and he's probably like in his late 50s and, retired cop. And I was a little worried about like, well, what's this going to be like? And he's going to be like strong and buff and that kind of thing. But then I realized like, a lot of men who sort of cultivate these very strong muscular bodies, they don't really have the experience of moving in their body the way you need to for a martial art, where I had a little bit more of that experience of moving my body in that way because of yoga. And it was also a really good experience just to like be in the presence of the kind of person, that I wouldn't normally feel comfortable around. And the thing that I really got out of it was learning how to embody my boundaries in a way, how to say yes and how to say no and how to deflect and how to strike too, and how to defend myself. So, I practiced for maybe a year and a half or 2 years and I really liked it. And the only reason I stopped was just because of my work schedule and the training didn't really go together. But it was something that really stuck with me, and it really... like, I noticed how it affected me, not just physically to be able to defend myself or hold my boundaries physically, but to, assert myself emotionally, verbally, psychologically, and protect myself in that way too.
Yeah. And I would say, especially with boundaries work, there's a lot of like this mental aspect of like, what are your boundaries, this sort of thing. And it's hard for people to enforce their boundaries. There's this discomfort around that. And literally, especially with Wing Chun, it's very much, there's certain kinds of blocks, and the blocks come out of the heart space. And the heart space is where you connect with other people. And so this is going into like the more spiritual aspect of martial arts. And if you think of like your blocks coming out of your heart, out of your space of connection, you're practicing staying connected with someone, but then asserting yourself and moving them out of your field or bringing them back into your field. And I think that constant repetition, because martial arts is about repetition. One of my masters, I trained in China for a couple of years, and one of my masters made me do like the same kick 1,000 times each day, over and over and over. And it's all of that repetition. So the more you repeat something again and again and again, it gets sunk so deep into you that it becomes a muscle memory. So that now when someone's saying something to you, you're like, boop, you know how to take that action and like revert it or push it out of your field, let's say, because you've practiced that same block over and over and over again. Yeah. And I think that discipline is so important. The discipline and repetition is so important because that's what allows you to become a master in some ways. So you can master yourself and how you exert yourself or how you express yourself out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that muscle memory part, because I remember while I was practicing, at one point I had gone to visit my family, and I have an older brother who always likes to sort of wrestle with me and that kind of thing, and I don't like it. And, he tried to attack me, and I didn't even think about it. I just hit him or something, and he's like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? It just sort of like came out of nowhere. So you're right, that repetition is very helpful, because then your body just does something automatically when the need arises, and you don't have to think about it.
Exactly. I had a similar story. My uncle used to wrestle me a lot when I was younger. And then a couple of years ago, he tried to wrestle me. So he kind of came up to me I took two fingers and I poked him right in a specific spot and he just stopped. And he's like, oh, what happened? And I'm like, huh? It was so instinctual. I was like, oh, I don't know what happened, but I hit him in a certain pressure point that causes you to stop and take a deep breath. So he literally had to stop and take a breath. And he's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not going to play with him now. I'm like, nope.
So I'm wondering if you're willing to share, but, hearing you talk about your story and especially like having gone to China, being in a world and a community of Kung Fu and martial arts that I imagine is probably mostly straight men or straight folks and not a lot of Black people, probably mostly white people and Asian people. Mm-hmm. What it's been like for you to be a queer person of color in these communities?
It has been beautiful because no one expects it of me. And I think that shock factor is kind of important because it wakes people up to the realization that there's a variety of people who can be doing a variety of kinds of practices. So I'm fluent in Chinese. So when I'm living in China and I'm speaking to people in Chinese, they're shocked by someone that looks like me who can speak their language and have a fluent conversation with them. When I'm in the martial arts studio and I have like my braids or I dress sort of gender fluid when I'm training. So I have like a crop top or a tank top on. People are kind of shocked by what I'm wearing. It just shows them there's a variety of people who can do these kinds of practices. Mm-hmm. I think it's been liberating for myself because I'm showing up in these spaces. And then for other people who want to show up a little bit differently, I think that's important because I'm giving people permission to try out different identities or to be themselves in this particular space. Mm-hmm. And I haven't really been in a room with a lot of queer martial artists until I competed in the Gay Olympics a couple years ago. And I was just surrounded by queer martial artists. And when I was in that space, I felt so much love and care. And it was the most beautiful space that I've ever been in. And I was like, I want to recreate this, for myself so I can have this community of people. Mm-hmm. And so I don't see it very often, but when I do see it, it's absolutely beautiful and it's important. And I'm willing to spread myself out to go into these different spaces to invite people into this community because it's important that people see parts of themselves represented in their teachers, which we don't see very much in our society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I'm glad that you are creating that community for folks. So, you've talked a little bit about the spiritual practice and we got more into talking about the physical practice, but I'm wondering, how you bring that in, especially if you have students or folks in your workshops that you do who may have had a negative experience around religion or spirituality or just don't identify as a spiritual person. Like, how do you bring that in?
Yeah. So I find that if people are talking to me, they're interested in spirituality, at least in the slightest. But it's funny enough, my previous partner was very against a lot of things spiritual. So I actually learned how to communicate these practices because of them. And I found that when I talk to people about nature and their experience in nature, it's a way of talking about the energy of the invisible world, of the numinous, of the unknown in a way that's very tangible for them. I talk about doing this movement and lifting your hands as if you're a bird that's lifting your wings for the very first time. And when I tell people that, they're like, oh, I think I've seen that before. And then they can do the movement in that way. And the chi, the energy that rises up within them when they do that is absolutely amazing. And that's spiritual. They might not call that spiritual. They're just calling it, oh, I'm lifting my arms like a bird. I'm letting my hand die with sorrow and I'm letting my other hand come up to catch it. I say these kind of weird teachings, but these weird teachings kind of prick the spiritual aspects of people without saying like, this is spirit, mm-hmm. This is God, these are these things, because those words are triggering for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. My undergraduate work was in linguistics. So I'm very careful around the words that I use when I talk to people about certain things. And so I guess just to say like nature and people's experience in nature is always a beautiful way to connect to something beyond themselves. Especially if they've traveled, and talking to people who have traveled is amazing because they can talk about the ruins that they've been to, the really interesting naturescapes that they're at. And then when they talk about it, those places become alive for the other people within the group as well. So it creates this beautiful net, this group of spiritual exploration just through nature.
Yeah. And I imagine, you just talking about, I forget how you said it, but sort of dying like a leaf and reaching up to catch it. It sounds very poetic. And I can imagine that probably in China where they're teaching it, like they're using that languaging when they're teaching the pose or the movement to give you an idea, but also to get in touch with the energy, which is part of the spiritual practice.
It's somewhat there. It's more in the literature. And because I read Chinese, I can see it within the literature. It's not taught that way.
Oh, okay.
Now it's so it's more calisthenic. People do martial arts to work out or get a certain body type. One of my teachers, her name is Genevieve Sophia Dow. She's very focused on the poetic quality of movement. She has this term like mythopoetry. So how do you move in a way that you become your own poetry? And you're creating yourself through the poetry of your own movement. And so that's what's really inspired a huge aspect of my teaching. And it is helpful for people. When I tell them to let their hands die like a leaf, that's also the experience of like letting a lover go. It's also the experience of deciding I'm not going to take that job. And you have this embodied feeling of what that's like. So when the life experience comes, whether or not that feels authentic to you, whether or not that feels good or bad, because you've had that poetry that's embedded into the practice to give you a different perspective.
Yeah. And even though something in your life may be ending, that it's not the end of the story.
Exactly. Because the leaf goes down, it disintegrates, and then its nutrients go back into the soil to help the grass grow. So things die, and then they don't really die, but they change. They change and they allow for new growth, for rebirth to happen.
Yeah. And I can see how what you're really doing is you're teaching people about transformation, transforming their bodies and their minds and their spirits through these practices.
Yes. Transformation has been a huge aspect to my own life experience. I've been in so many different spaces and I've had to show up differently and very adaptable because I know how to almost shapeshift according to an environment, but not lose my core.
Yeah.
I can keep my core intact, but then allow the other parts of myself to mold so I can comfortably navigate different spaces. So transformation is huge. That's why I work a lot with the energy of the fox, because the foxes are one of the ultimate beings of transformation.
Yeah, the fox has special meaning for me too.
Yay.
I've heard a lot of queer folks, especially queer elders, talk about the role of queer folks is to be agents of transformation and to be shapeshifters, to make connections between, the gaps in our culture. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Really bringing that forward in this work.
Yeah. I feel like there's this book that I read a long time ago, and it talked about how it's focused on gayness. So being gay is a way for you to expand the consciousness of society, to say that there's another way of loving, of being in the world that's not the mainstream way, but it's another way for you to then start to think about what is it that I desire and why do I desire that? So we become a way for other people to expand themselves or think about how to expand themselves beyond the norms that they might feel like they're stuck into.
Yeah. Do you remember what that book was?
It's called Gay Spirituality by Toby Johnson, I believe.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So DeVante, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
I'll say the person. So the person I mentioned before, Genevieve Sophia Dow, she is a beautiful trans martial artist, theater director, poet, philosopher. And just being around her and learning with her has taught me so much about what it means to not feel like I need to fit into a box, but I can expand my own queerness. And a lot of the practices that I teach derive from her own experience and her teachings. So I'm very grateful to her for teaching me how to hold these opposing energies and allow them to expand within myself so I can own my gender fluidity, my gayness, my Blackness, my anime nerd lovingness, all these different aspects of myself. I'm able to hold them comfortably and watch them grow within myself.
Great. So DeVante, where can people find you and learn more about your work and your offerings?
My website is healingkungfu.com. Very straightforward. And on there, you'll see information about my weekly classes, which are on Sunday mornings. They're all online, so people can hop in any part of the world. And my Instagram and TikTok is at Healing Kung Fu. So everything's Healing Kung Fu. And there you'll see videos and images and inspiring ways for you to rethink how to show up in the world.
Great. Well, DeVante, thank you for being here and sharing about your transformative and empowering work in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope everyone has a great day.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by following the show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be well.